So the plan for today is we're going to start talking about the plants. We're going to spend some time talking about the different groups of plants, and if you've started reading the chapter, then you might already be getting overwhelmed with names of different taxonomic groups and so on. I think the strategy for discussing the plants, I'm going to try very hard not to overwhelm you with taxonomic names, but try to help you focus on the major differences between just a very small number of large plant groups and focus on the really important phenomena that are relevant to plants. So I'll be giving advice as we go through, or information about what kind of information you're responsible for, what taxonomic names I do expect you to know, what ones I don't expect you to know. Same thing for botanical anatomical terms. So while we're talking about the plants and any taxonomic group, as mentioned before, I'm going to pair taxonomic groups with discussion of really important biological phenomena that will be discussed within the context of that taxonomic group. And the important biological phenomena we'll be talking about today are complex life cycles and also the evolutionary transition from an aquatic existence to a terrestrial existence. One small quick announcement. I just want to alert you, happy news, there's been a very small change in the grading policy. The grading settings are very complicated mastering bio, but I'm changing just one item, and that is the penalty associated with an incorrect guess on multiple choice. I've ramped that down a bit, so it's no longer this formula right here, which is sort of the standard. I've just changed it to just a decrement of 10%, so it'll be less painful. Nothing else has been changed. There's still a 10% penalty for every 24 hours past the due date, but it's still open. But you can still only try 3 different answers for any given question within any assignment. If you ever have a question about the grading policy, when you're working on a Mastering Bio homework assignment, you can just click on the link that says grading policy and it'll pop it up. Okay. I was asked to make a couple of announcements. A member of Theta Psi asked me to bring this to your attention. This is a new co-ed professional sustainability fraternity, and so they're very interested in environmentally responsible sustainability. And so this relates to the ecological section of this class. I'm going to go ahead and let you know about this. If you're interested, all of this information in the contact information for the individuals that are helping run this club are in the Clubs and Other Opportunities tab. I also want to bring this to your attention. This is a brand new course that's being offered through the University of California Natural Reserve System, and apparently it's starting next fall. The name of this course is California Ecology and Conservation. This is a really different kind of course because it's the only course that a student takes during that time, apparently. What the students actually do, they spend 7 weeks at the UC Natural Reserve. So there's a number of different locations that make up the natural reserve systems. This will be held in the fall, spring, and summer quarters. It's open for students from all UC campuses, but it's limited to a grand total of only 27 students per course. So it's going to be a very small course, and you'll be off-site, which is why you earn so many credits. So if you're coming from a quarter system such as UCI, then you would get 19 quarter units for participation in this course. Anyway, it looks like fun, doesn't it? Look at all these great places. So these are the topics that are covered. So if you're interested in a really different kind of class experience, this might be something you want to look into. The various flyers they sent me are all linked on the Clubs and Other Opportunities tab here. Okay, let's now turn our attention to complex life cycles. This is something that I have to say students find very confusing because we have a pretty simple life cycle, and so that makes it a little tricky to learn about some of the complex life cycles in the plants and the protists. But let's consider what's actually meant by a life cycle and what makes a life cycle complex. So in general, we didn't see the, okay, is this going to work? Let's see here. In general, we don't see complex life cycles until we hit the eukaryotes because there are, in fact, a number of different phenomena that one doesn't see until one hits the eukaryotes. So before we discussed the complexity of this internal cellular structure of eukaryotes, Now we're considering the complexity of their overall life cycle, meaning the stages, the reproduction of the organisms during their life. It's not until the eukaryotes, and this is usually or most, there are always exceptions in biology, so that's why one can't say all. But anyway, one does not see meiosis until one hits the eukaryotes. So for example, in the prokaryotes, we did not see meiosis, that kind of cell division where one ends up after 2 successive cell divisions with 4 daughter cells, each of whom has half the number of chromosomes as the original cell prior to meiosis. Something else that we see in eukaryotes that we did not see in prokaryotes is that most usually eukaryotes have both a haploid and a diploid stage. We did not see this in prokaryotes. They are haploid pretty much entirely. And something else we see in eukaryotes that relates to this is that you see sexual reproduction, and this is not something you see in prokaryotes, which just simply have fission. And so the types of stages and how reproduction relates to these different life stages is what can make these cycles complex. But examples, I think, make this much clearer. So let's go ahead and jump into an example right now using this charming creature, dinoflagellate gyrodinium. This is a unicellular protist. Here's a little movie, because it's a little hard to capture the tremendous charm of this beast to form a static picture like this. So this is a single-celled. I know it's a little hard to tell from the picture if you're not familiar with it, because after all, there are grooves in this organism which make it look like it's multicellular. It's not. It is unicellular, meaning it is only made up of one cell. That's it. Hey, dinoflagellates are protists. They're photosynthetic. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples of protist complex life cycles, because that's where we see the complex life cycles. Then we're going to connect that up to the complex life cycles we see in plants. So this specific organism is unicellular, and this specific organism is haploid. Okay, so 1N, in case you can't see that. Dinoflagellates can be photosynthetic. They can also ingest prey, so they're both phototrophs and heterotrophs, so they're really quite different, very interesting creatures. They have 2 flagella, which is how they move around. So let's go ahead and consider then the life cycles of this particular kind of dinoflagellate, which is we start with one, and then what happens to it? How do we get more? They do have asexual reproduction, is shown here by this sort of gray circle. And so asexual reproduction just simply means what? That an individual divides into 2. There's only one cell. That one cell divides into 2. And then each of those individuals then can later divide into 2. And it's a cycle that can repeat and repeat and repeat. Notice, by the way, that your Scientific Illustrator has provided for your convenience a color coding to the ploidy stage of the individuals in the life cycle. So these blue arrows show that at that point in time of the life cycle, the individual is haploid, and if it's red, then it's diploid. So we started with a haploid individual that just simply divided into 2 mitotically, right? Mitosis. And so it's staying haploid. So it can just cycle around and around and around. So you might be thinking, well, then why is this called a complex life cycle? Obviously, this is not complicated. What makes it complicated is the other part. And that is that these dinoflagellates, exact same dinoflagellates, can also reproduce sexually. So how does that work? After all, they're already haploid. What happens is that under certain conditions, then the daughter cells, which are generated mitotically, then can combine with other haploid cells of the same species, as shown over here in the lower left. And so they're acting as gametes, even though they're the same ploidy as the cell that divided to produce them. When they fuse together, this is, of course, a fertilization, which in our species we think of as sperm meeting egg, although these are obviously the same size and same type, so they're not described as sperm and eggs. They're just called gametes. But when they fuse, then you one ends up with a diploid zygote. So just as in humans, when a sperm fertilizes an egg, one ends up with two haploid cells making a single diploid cell. The zygote then is now diploid. See, the arrow has changed to red with the fertilization. Immediately undergoes meiosis, generating then a number of haploid individuals again. And so this cycle can continue. So it can cycle on the left, it can cycle on the right. And you might be wondering, well, under what conditions does one have sexual versus asexual reproduction? And this is actually follows a fairly general pattern, which is that asexual reproduction in many types of organisms, not just protists, but many other different kinds of organisms as well, one typically sees asexual reproduction during more constant conditions, and and sexual reproduction when there are changing conditions. So in other words, it's environmentally determined whether or not the individuals are going to reproduce asexually or sexually. And so this can be things such as a changing temperature. That's the Greek letter delta, which means a change, right? A change in temperature. A decrease in food is often something that will trigger sexual reproduction. Increase in crowding of individuals is also something that can typically trigger sexual reproduction. So there are environmental triggers that then generate sexual reproduction. And what are the consequences of sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction? Well, one ends up with offspring that are genetically variable, right? Potentially genetically variable here. So we have genetically variable offspring being generated during sexual reproduction and not here, where they're genetically identical. Genetically identical. I'm sometimes asked, well, doesn't mutation occur? How can you say these are genetically identical? Well, yes, mutation is always occurring at some very, very low level, or cell division. Cell replication does not always end up in exact perfect duplicates. That's absolutely true. So genetically identical, we can always say, except for any mutation that's going on. But that's really quite different from the kind of genetic variability that is generated from combining individuals from different sources. Okay? So, okay, let's consider another complex life cycle here. This one is more complicated because unlike the dinoflagellate, which is a marine organism, it's in the plankton, it's in the sea, so whether it's going asexual or sexual or asexual reproduction, it's still just surrounded by seawater. This example of a protist, the genus Plasmodium, which is an infamous protist because of the amount of human suffering it causes. This is the causal agent of malaria, one of the huge killers of humans on the planet. Several different species of Plasmodium. But what makes this life cycle so complicated is that part of the life cycle takes place in one environment, namely a human host, and the other part of the life cycle takes place in a completely different environment, namely the body of the mosquito host. So let's walk through this and consider how this works. I find that students often find this diagram a bit confusing, so let's spend a little time demystifying it. So we're going to start with a mosquito bite in the upper left-hand part of this diagram here. So, as the mosquito then sticks its mouth parts into a human, because mosquitoes feed on human blood, so it's piercing the skin and going after a blood vessel. Like all blood feeders, the mosquito injects saliva into the human. This has a number of different functions. So, for example, there are anticoagulants being injected into the blood to stop the blood from clotting, which is really inconvenient, something that blood does, which makes it really hard to feed on if you're a fluid feeder. So injecting the saliva then into the host is how the Plasmodium is introduced in the first place. It's actually injected into the bloodstream directly, and then what you're looking at here, let me go on to the next step here. This shows infection of liver cells. So this is supposed to represent a liver cell. This is not supposed to be a Plasmodium. There's the Plasmodium right there, the small green object. So these have been injected into the bloodstream directly. The blood circulates around the entire body. When it goes through the liver, then the Plasmodium leave the bloodstream, enter the liver cells, and what? Start reproducing. As you can see in the top part of this diagram here, we started with one little green object. We have lots and lots of green objects, and then the cell is bursting here, right? So what has been going on? This is obviously then what? Asexual reproduction, where we started with an individual that kept dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing, and every time it goes through a division cycle, then the number doubles. Once they pop out, bursting the liver cells and enter the blood in general, then they're in the bloodstream, and now the plasmodium has an opportunity to enter a red blood cell. These red objects here are supposed to represent red blood cells, and so when the plasmodium, then these shown here as these little green dots, enter the red blood cell, what happens again? More asexual reproduction. Again, doubling in number every time there's a cycle of reproduction, and until they're so numerous that they start popping the red blood cells. And so this causes many of the symptoms associated with the terrible disease, malaria. So we started with what might have been a very small number of plasmodium individuals, and we end up with huge numbers because of this kind of asexual reproduction. This, by the way, would now be a dead end if at this point, for those particular individuals, those plasmodium who are making life miserable for this human and popping its liver cells and its red blood cells, these plasmodium would not continue have any further descendants unless what happens next? Another mosquito comes along and sucks some blood out of this human. Right? Because that's this next step here. The plasmodium now has to leave the human host and enter the mosquito. Okay, so what happens then? As the mosquito sticks its mouth parts into the human skin, slurps up some blood, sucks up a bunch of the red blood cells, and of course any of the plasmodium that are in the blood. And within the gut of the mosquito then, the plasmodium change in form to what are now called gametes. Why? Because they now have the capability of fusing, as shown here, and forming a diploid zygote. All the way along up to this point, you may have noticed all the arrows were blue, similarly to the dinoflagellates we were just looking at. It's been haploid up until this point. Once the gametes fuse together, we end up with a diploid individual here, which then immediately undergoes meiosis. We end up with a bunch of haploid individuals again, and the cycle continues here. So this is much more complicated because of the different environments involved. And so, of course, individuals who are trying to stop the spread of malaria have focused on a number of different points of possible vulnerability. How can you break this cycle, right? You could stop mosquitoes from biting humans in the first place, right? That would break this right here. Or perhaps you can stop mosquitoes from picking up plasmodium from humans at this point. So far, there are a lot of people working on this very serious problem, including some individuals here at UCI working on different aspects of this. So this is another case where we have sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. The last example from the protists is another complex life cycle. This one, though, has a special name. This one is called alternation of generations. And this is a term that you will see in the plants as well, although this specific example is for a protist. And the protist is shown over here on the left. This is an example of a brown alga or kelp. And what is meant by the term alternation of generations? That specifically refers to a life cycle in which there is alternation between a multicellular haploid form and a multicellular diploid form. Okay? Completely different from us, right? You think of what happens in humans. We certainly have a multicellular diploid form, but we don't have a multicellular haploid form. So let's see what's going on with this brown alga. If we start over here on the left, there's a picture of what may be a familiar brown alga if you've been off the waters off the coast here in California. This might be a familiar sight to you. This form is called a sporophyte. It's called a sporophyte. Yes, that is a term you'll need to know because it produces spores. Okay, so that's not too hard. A sporophyte is a multicellular organism that is producing spores. It is diploid, if you can read the label here, it says 2N here, so this is a diploid individual. Now notice this label here, it says meiosis occurs in specialized structures. So this should actually remind you of humans, right? We're multicellular diploid organisms, right? We have specialized structures where meiosis occurs, right? In humans, they're called gonads. In females, it's the ovaries producing eggs via meiosis. And in males, it's the testes producing sperm via meiosis. So this then should be at least somewhat familiar, and it's just a specialized structure within the diploid multicellular organism. But notice after meiosis, these are not called gametes, these are called spores, something completely different, because after all, I did point out that in this case it is called a sporophyte because it produces spores. So how are spores different from gametes? Spores are completely different because they're not going to combine and undergo fertilization, even though notice that they are haploid. Rather, these spores are going to spread in the environment, and because we're talking about a marine creature, then they're spreading in the seawater. They can land, the cells will start dividing, and they form what? A multicellular form over here. So here's one multicellular form over here, and this one is diploid on the left, and this is the other multicellular form, and this one is haploid over here on the right. There is some variation between different protists. This is a protist here, but this specific one, there is a difference between ones that will end up producing sperm and ones that are producing eggs. These are called gametophytes. This is another term that I will expect you to know. And gametophytes produce gametes, just as sporophytes produce spores. They're already haploid. So the sperm and eggs are produced via mitosis, not meiosis, right? Because they're already haploid, and so no further reduction of number of chromosomes, copies of each chromosome, is possible. Sperm fertilizes egg, and then we're back to a diploid stage. Okay, so this is what occurs in some protist groups. But the term alternation of generations is used for any organism, whether it's a protist or not, that has an alternation between multicellular haploid and multicellular diploid forms. So now we're going to go ahead and make the transition to the so-called green plants. This is actually a technical term which may surprise you. After all, it just looks like an adjective and a common noun here. When a biologist uses the term green plants, they actually mean something fairly specific. They mean the combination of two sister taxa, the green algae, which are a group of protists, and the sister group to the green algae, the green plants. And just to remind you, the land plants. Their relationship, I've got figure 30-1 from your textbook up in front of you now to remind you of where these sit in the grand scheme of the phylogenetic tree of life shown in front of you right now. So, land plants are thought to have evolved from a green algal-like ancestor, which means that the most recent common ancestor of green algae and the land plants like this is thought to resemble sort of today's green algae, which is why the most recent common ancestor between the green algae and the land plants is described as being like a green alga, meaning like a green alga, the green algae today. Although obviously there's been just as much time for evolution and diversification within the green algae as there has been from the land plants. Now, before we talk about the evolution of land plants from an aquatic green algal-like ancestor, because we were just discussing complex life cycles, let's go ahead and just continue on that theme and consider this really important synapomorphy for all land plants. So this is green plants that are not green algae, right? So land plants, meaning plants that are terrestrial. All land plants have alternation of generations, which is the complex life cycle type that we were just walking through for an example of a protist. Meaning there's a multicellular haploid stage and a multicellular diploid stage, and there's alternation between them in a regular way, in a cyclical manner, such as is diagrammed in a general way for you in figure 31-12 from your textbook, which is in front of you right now. So again, just as we were looking at on that brown alga, over here on the left we have a sporophyte. It is multicellular, it is diploid, It produces spores, right? Sporophytes produce spores. Over here on the right, we have a gametophyte, and it's going to produce, it's also multicellular, but it's haploid. And it's going to produce gametes, because gametophytes produce gametes. The gametes then fuse during fertilization to form a zygote, which undergoes cell division to form a multicellular sporophyte. Okay, so this should seem very familiar, since we just walked through this with the brown alga. This is what we'll see for all the land plants that we're going to go through now, and it won't always look exactly like this. There'll be variations on this theme, but all these parts occur in all of the land plants. So I find that students find this extremely difficult to wrap their minds around and really quite confusing. I think in part that's because when one looks at a diagram such as this, you're a bit distracted by the artwork, so I thought, let's get rid of the artwork and let's just cut this down to absolute bare bones so that we can just totally wrap our minds around this and it will make perfect sense. Okay, alternation of generations. What do we have? We have 4 different primary stages that we're concerned with here. We have a sporophyte. Remember, this is multicellular, and this is diploid. And we know that a sporophyte does what? It produces spores. These are single-celled, so they're unicellular, meaning they only have one cell, and they're haploid. They undergo cell division to form a multicellular form, which is haploid, and the gametophyte then produces gametes, which are also unicellular and haploid. Gametes then fuse to form a diploid sporophyte. Okay, so if you can just wrap your mind around this pattern, then this will make learning the land plants much easier for you, I think, and as you walk through the different life cycles, if you keep this in mind, it'll make much more sense to you and hopefully will be far less confusing, okay? So, multicellular, 2 different multicellular forms, and let's see if we look at this a little bit more in a slightly different form here. The only diploid stage then is the sporophyte, okay? Everything else is haploid, okay? So if you understand this, and it made sense to you then, you should be able to answer this clicker question, right? And this is an answer counts clicker question, meaning you get more credit if you actually answer this correctly. I would think, honestly, this is straightforward enough that I would expect far more than 90% of you to get this right. Here's hoping. Okay, so here's the diagram that we've just been discussing, right? The alternation of generations. Sporophyte produces spores. Spores grow into gametophytes. Gametophytes produce gametes, et cetera, right? So there's something different happening with each one of those arrows, obviously. I want to know, what is the process occurring at the point in the life cycle indicated by the X? So that's right here, the transition from spores to gametophyte. What's happening here? Is it meiosis? Is it mitosis? Is it fertilization? What's going on here? If you're not sure, great time to get friendly with your neighbor and pick their brains. I'll give you 20 seconds or so and then check back in with you. Okay, everybody picked an answer? Everybody's clicked in, I hope? Okay, looks like it's stabilized. Let's see. Do we have 90%? Yes! Well, ooh, 86. Sheesh. Good grief. Man, okay. All right, the 14% of you who missed this need to think about this a little bit more, right? So the second favorite answer, which was incorrect, was meiosis, right? When do you have meiosis? When you go from a diploid stage to a haploid stage. So the only time you have meiosis here is right there, right? At this stage, going from a sporophyte to spores, because you're going from diploid to haploid. That's it, right? And similarly, fertilization will be going from haploid to diploid, so that would be at this location right here, which was also not where the X was located. So you're going from a unicellular to a multicellular haploid individual, and so all that's going on in production of a multicellular organism from a unicellular starting point is just regular, generic cell division mitosis, right? So that's what's going on there. All right. So if you missed that, you should spend a little time reviewing that, I think. But I'm glad 86% of you got it. Okay. So I mentioned that this alternation of generations that we were just discussing is a synapomorphy for the land plants. We're now looking at a phylogenetic tree of the major groups of land plants and some of the close relatives. This is figure 31-6 from your textbook in front of you right now. And the alternation of generations is a synapomorphy for the land plants. Is not actually put on this figure. If you wanted to put it on there, it would then be at this location here. You might be wondering, well, now, why is she saying that's a synapomorphy? After all, isn't a synapomorphy by definition a shared derived characteristic of a group that is not shared with other close relatives? Yes, that is true. And so you might be thinking, well, but didn't we see alternation of generations in some of the protists? Absolutely. But the alternation of generation that is seen in some of the protists is thought to have evolved convergently or independently several times because of the placement of alternation of generations on a phylogenetic tree. It's pretty clear that it's evolved independently many times. And for land plants, then the alternation of generations then that is shared by all land plants and is not shared by the close green algal relatives then is presumed to have an independent origin right here. So it is properly then considered a synapomorphy because it is an independent derivation of that character. So the fact that the land plants share it then is because of shared ancestry. Okay, so the closest relatives, the sister group then to the land plants, are these various groups of green algae. And as mentioned before, green algae are primarily aquatic, so the origin of land plants then involves a transition from an aquatic existence to a terrestrial existence. So let's consider the biological ramifications of such a transition, and also, when did this occur? As promised before, anytime we're talking about when did some major event in the history of life on the planet occur, we're going to go back and revisit our familiar timeline. We're hardly filling in any of these points to make it as painless as possible, but I do think it's important for your understanding that you have some idea of what happened when. So again, here is figure 28-6 from your textbook in front of you right now. Again, to remember, right now is up at the very top. Formation of the planet, the solar system is way down at the bottom. And here, way up at the top, where it is different colors, is our very own eon, the Phanerozoic. And so hopefully you're all thinking, oh yes, this is just simply the last 500 million years. And the first period in the Phanerozoic, which is the only period that I am requiring you to know the name of, is the Cambrian, right? And so this is where we had the Cambrian explosion right here that we've already discussed. If we go back in time, then origin of life is approximately here. The first cyanobacteria are thought to have occurred around here. Why are cyanobacteria significant? Because it was their appearance as the very first oxygenic photosynthesizers that then started the oxygenation of our atmosphere and our planet. So that's oxygen started to build up at this point here. Here we have the very first eukaryotes, although the tremendous diversification, as mentioned before, took place right here. But when, in all these other exciting big notable events here, when did land plants then evolve from green algae? Well, it's the period right after the Cambrian. Okay, so notice I didn't even say what the period's name was. Okay, I'm trying so hard not to overburden you with necessary names. I think it's much more helpful just to have a couple of guideposts and then think about what is happening relative to those. So we won't even worry about what its name is, but this should strike you as fairly interesting, I hope, in that during the Cambrian, approximately 500 million years ago, there was this tremendous diversification going on in the sea, but this was not happening on the terrestrial landscape. So in fact, when land plants made the transition to the terrestrial landscape, it was pretty barren because the land plants, the fungi, were the very first multicellular colonizers of the terrestrial environment before the animals started appearing on the planet. So very, very different landscape than, of course, we think of now when we think of a typical terrestrial landscape. So when you think of this transition, then you cannot have in your mind's eye what the surface of terrestrial areas are like now, because it was really very different at that time. Where's my arrow? There it is. This other way. Okay, as mentioned before, most of the close relatives of the land plants are aquatic, and therefore it's thought that land plants evolved from a green algal-like ancestor, specifically from the green algal forms that are multicellular in fresh water, because that's where they fall out on the phylogenetic trees. And here's a perfect example of terms that you are absolutely not responsible for. You don't need to know your stoneworts, for example. But these are examples of multicellular freshwater forms that are current representatives of the groups that are the sister groups for the land plants. And how do we know this? Well, we can compare various characteristics, and so many of the characteristics are chemical or physiological or structural. So, for example, many of the common features between green algae and land plants, in particular the green algae that are the closest green algal relatives of the land plants, are specific types of chlorophyll and the other associated chloroplast biochemical machinery, such as the accessory pigments. The exact chemical nature of these compounds is much more similar between land plants and these green algae, these particular green algae, than it is between other living organisms. There are lots of similarities of the cell walls. We're not going into that. Various specialized structures that are very similar, internal organelles in the cytoplasm, similarities in sperm structure, similarities in storage products. One is actually extremely familiar. Starch is a polymer, carbohydrate polymer that should be familiar to all of you. And so that is a storage product that we see in land plants and green algae, but we don't see in animals, for example. We don't store extra calories as starch. So what's involved then in making a transition from an aquatic life to a terrestrial existence? Well, let's consider the pros and cons. Here you have an organism that is underwater. In order to make the transition to terrestrial lifestyle, then there are going to be some things that are challenges, and we'll put those on the con side of the ledger here, and there might be even some advantages. So let's consider what those are from the context, of course, of a plant. One of the huge pros or positive aspects associated with a terrestrial existence to the very early organisms that might have ended up in a terrestrial existence was because there was a barren landscape here, unlike the sea, which was teeming with a tremendous diversity of animals. After all, we had just had the Cambrian explosion, right? Tons of animals, many of which are herbivores, chomping on all these plants. And in great contrast then on the terrestrial landscape, there were no multicellular animals, there are no herbivores, so you're not going to get chewed on and eaten, so that's a definite pro. Similarly, because of the barren landscape, there's far less competition for any kind of limiting resources, such as space or so on. There's a lot more light. As soon as you emerge from the water and you're in the air, you have much more intense light impacting you. This is less of an issue, of course, for animals, but remember, we're talking about photosynthesizers. We're talking about plants, and so light then is a very important source of energy, and therefore this is a significant event for the pro column. What else? More carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is much more readily available in gaseous atmosphere than it is in water, where it is dissolved in water. So these are all advantages of being in a terrestrial landscape. But all is not completely rosy. Some of the disadvantages then, the biggest, most important, immediately obvious one is that as you emerge from the water and you're out in the air, you start to dry out. This is the same meaning as the word desiccate. Oops, I think there's two C's. Yes, there are. Dry out or desiccation. So organisms are water-based, and that means that all organisms that are exposed to air have to deal with evaporative water loss, and so this is a real problem for anything that's terrestrial. Another con of being out in the air as opposed to being in an aquatic lifestyle is that there is less mechanical support, just simply because you've lost the buoyancy of the surrounding water. So the meaning from the surrounding medium. So if you think of your experiences then, your mechanical experiences of interacting with air, or when you jump into a swimming pool, how different it feels. Falling down in the water is not as difficult or painful, for example. The forces acting on you are really quite different because of the buoyancy of the greater density of a liquid medium relative to a gaseous medium. And another con is that sexual reproduction is problematic. Why is that? Because of the whole issue of sperm transfer. So in green algae and in many of the very first land plants, the sperm had to swim to the egg. And so this is pretty straightforward and easy if you're underwater. It's much more problematic if you're terrestrial. So let's go through then this list and consider how land plants actually deal then with these challenges. We'll start with dealing with desiccation, dealing with dry conditions. And so, of course, it is reasonable to assume that there were transitional forms, that the very first land plants didn't make an abrupt and immediate transition from being completely aquatic to being completely terrestrial. It is reasonable to assume that there were transitional steps where perhaps an organism was just partially submerged and partially exposed to the air, and that this would gradually change over evolutionary time. So during this transitional time, of course, it could be that only a portion of the body as a whole, only a portion of the tissues would be bathed in fluid, which means the part sticking out in the air is the part that would be drying. And so that part that could be drying then, well, there's two separate issues here. One is to prevent water loss, evaporative water loss from the part that's sticking out in the air, which means what? Waterproofing. And the other thing is to transport water from the parts, the lower parts of the body that might be in the water and have access to water, transportation of fluids to the rest of the body. Two completely different things. Let's go ahead and discuss both of those using a phylogenetic tree as a little backdrop here. This is figure 31-9 from your textbook, and just shows part of the phylogenetic tree of the land plants, sort of focusing on that initial transition. So let's consider first waterproofing in land plants and prevention of water loss. There was a aspect of life of green algae which helped land plants make the transition to a terrestrial existence, and that was the fact that in green algae, certain parts of their life cycle were encased in a very tough coating of a particular chemical compound called sporopollenin. This is a kind of waxy polymer, and so it's very good at waterproofing. This was not so much an issue for the green algae. It's also a mechanical protection and chemical protection, which is the main purpose or adaptation of this coating in the spores or zygotes of green algae. But because it's also waterproofing, what that meant was that when the those first land plants that were taking up a somewhat terrestrial existence then at least had some waterproofing protection then for the spores or the zygotes because of the existence of this waxy polymer coating. So the sporopollenin then, sporopollenin is a synapomorphy shared by all green plants, right? Remembering that green plants include both the green algae and all the land plants. So that's something that's shared by all of them. But we can see that here is another evolutionary novelty then that arose during the very early on in the evolution of the land plants, which provided waterproofing, and that is a structure called a cuticle. So this is basically a covering that is waterproofing, And so this is for the rest of the life stages, right? It's not just the spores and the zygotes that need waterproofing, it's the rest of the life stages. And this is where the cuticle then comes into play, which covers the plants and decreases the rate of evaporative water loss. The problem is if you coat yourself completely in something that's waterproof, then this has a disadvantage of cutting off gas exchange. And so notice that simultaneously we also have the pores or perforations, openings in the cuticle. So these are openings in the cuticle then that allows gas exchange. After all, we're talking about plants. They need access to carbon dioxide for making their organic compounds, for example. So in most plants, the plants have the ability to open and close the pores, and so these structures are then called stomata. These are just simply pores that can open and close. And so you can see that let me erase this. It looks like you can't see the word stomata. There we go. So you can see that very, very few land plants have pores that don't open and close. In fact, it's just this very small group called the liverworts right here. The stomata are a synapomorphy for all other land plants. So in virtually all plants, all land plants, except the liverworts, then the plants have the ability to open and close the pores, controlling gas exchange and decreasing evaporative water loss. So what does this look like? This is figure 31-7 from your textbook, showing what cuticle looks like. And so if one takes a leaf, for example, and chops it in cross-section, here's the cross-section shown here in higher magnification, so you're looking at the skinny leaf on the side, and then you have to magnify it so you can see what you're looking at here. The cuticle is covering all surfaces, so this is the cuticle right here. It's also, but it's not just on the upper surface here, it's also on the lower surface shown here. This is also the cuticle down here on this surface. So it's covering basically the entire surface of the plant, but it is in fact perforated by these openings called stomata, which can be opened and closed, controlling gas exchange. Okay, so that's then waterproofing. How about conduction of fluids from one part of the body to another? When you're talking about transport within a plant's body, you're talking about vascular tissue, which you can think of as the plant circulatory system. Now, not all plants have vascular tissue, and so mnemonically enough, the plants that do not have vascular tissue are called the non-vascular plants. And it's thought that the very first land plants, in fact, were non-vascular. And they're a small group of plants. Here are some examples here. I'm not holding you responsible for knowing a liverwort compared to a hornwort compared to a stonewort. I do expect you to know mosses as the easiest, most familiar, hopefully, example of non-vascular plants. So I'll expect you to know that as a representative example of a non-vascular plant. I will not hold you responsible for knowing the names of the other groups, but it helps if you have something in mind as you're thinking about non-vascular plants. So think mosses. So vascular tissues have two major functions, right? One, of course, is transport of fluids within the plant's body. The other one is mechanical support. Mechanical support, meaning it's actually functioning as sort of an internal skeleton, the vascular system in plants, which means that non-vascular plants do not have the mechanical support provided by vascular system. And in addition, they don't have the ability to transport fluids around, which is why these plants tend to be extremely small. And if you're familiar with what moss is like, then you're familiar with how small moss plants are like. So I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. We'll continue chatting about plants later. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.